This innovation in governance placed one emperor responsible for the entire Roman state, which in turn dominated the whole Mediterranean world for the next half millennium. As the earlier history of the Republic has shown, Rome is a dense topic, but the ironic difficulty with imperial Roman history is that the great Senatus Populusque Romanus had already won. At the death of Augustus, Rome stretched from Iberia to Africa, the long way, and while emperors did add a few more provinces in the following centuries, this new age was not defined by conquests, but the victorious quiet of the Pax Romana. Likewise, the poets and artists of the Augustan era had codified a new imperial identity for Rome, stepping out of Greece's shadow to set the standard for Roman culture. With so much groundwork diligently laid in the centuries BC, imperial Rome in these first 200 years AD was at the top of its game, with nothing left to do but create the most extravagant civilization they could. This rather uncharacteristically calm state of affairs gives us an opportunity to look at the structure and breathtaking scale of the Roman world before, of course, everything starts to go wrong. Don't worry, we'll get there. So, to see how Mediterranean society reached its peak under the rule of the Caesars, let's do some history. To begin with, we have Tiberius and Caligula crash into frame. Sigh. Okay, we might need to get through some shenanigans first, because what the empire lacks in grand conflicts between civilizations, it makes up for in an absolute carousel of royal wackos. These monarchs generally lack the charm of Caesar or the cleverness of Augustus, and are instead best known for the nonsense they got up to in their abundant time away from their one job. This all makes for excellent gossip, but the train wreck fascination runs thin by the time a fifth locomotive careens off the rails and crashes into the nearest turmoil orgy. And frankly, enough of these stories come to us, from historians and senators with axes to grind, in a culture that already loves exaggerating, that it is just best not to dwell on them. Which is why I invite your imagination to run wild as I treat the emperors as glorified timestamps. So, the distressingly low survival rate of Augustus's heirs led to Tiberius's landing on the throne, whereupon he holed up in his palace on the scenic island of Capri to enjoy the aforementioned carnival of orgies. His successor Caligula, whose nickname means Little Boots, is remembered for antics like nominating his horse for consul to insult the Senate and sending an army to collect seashells off the coast of Gaul. But he started a few notable trends. More building projects, for one, but also concentrating more power on himself, and critically being assassinated by his own guards in 41 AD. Now this may have been useful in the short term, but it doesn't bode great for future emperors, so we'll have plenty of time to discuss that later. At the moment, the Augustan reforms ensured that Roman armies didn't serve factions in the Senate or the personal whims of their generals, but the emperor. And after the turmoil of the late Republic, this setup lessened the threat of civil wars and let the army maintain the hard-won peace. By this point, the Roman military had reached peak form, or at least peak aesthetic, and the 30-odd legions were permanently stationed at the frontiers of the empire to project power beyond Rome's borders. On paper, there's quite a contrast between this smooth operating in the provinces and the hijinks of the royal palace, but by concentrating all of the crazy into one guy, the rest of the empire could function without obstructions or conflict. I doubt that was the plan, but it seemed to work. And it is here in the imperial era that the Roman world transformed from Italy's pile of provinces into an integrated Mediterranean system. On the sea, they called Mare Nostrum. The low cost and high speed of seaborne transportation allowed goods, resources, and plenty of food to flow between port cities. Grain from North Africa, metals from Iberia, wines from Gaul, and scholars from Ephesus could be found in every corner of the empire and even far beyond. As was often the case with Rome, commerce followed conquest. As new provinces made for new and exciting sources of wealth, and overland trade operated along the robust network of roads that was built to transport armies. This roadmap is one of the single most beautiful sights I've ever laid eyes on, and my wife Cayenne is really pretty. And the marble work doesn't stop there, because lest we forget, the Romans were engineering maniacs. Concrete, domes, arches, water highways that ferry delicious H2O from the mountains down into cities, heated floors. The Romans literally had no chill when it came to construction. And this marks a distinction between the quiet vibrance of private art and the big public works, where they never built a thing for the sake of its beauty, but rather for the sake of their glory. The true Roman artists were the engineers who built not only temples and theaters, but roads, bridges, aqueducts, and baths. It's a practical, functional artistry where the beauty lies in the accomplishment and its usefulness to the empire, and the fact that they are also beautiful is a flourish. A really big one. To illustrate a few converging themes, let's look at the single greatest monument to Roman extravagance, the Colosseum. Zooming back out, let's jump northwest to Britannia, where Emperor Claudius's first foray onto the Isle was later consolidated by Agricola, the governor who conquered Wales and northern England during the reign of Vespasian. Britannia was one of a few provinces added during the imperial era, and while its capital of Londinium was not a major metropolis of the Roman world, it does show us how fast Rome could plop down roots and establish a fully functioning city out of what seems like thin air. And while the city of Rome looks like an urban planner's nightmare, their later additions are planned so well it's insulting to the rest of us. Ah, the grids, it's beautiful. And Roman Britain is surprisingly well documented because Agricola's son-in-law was the historian Tacitus. His account of Britannia gives a good look at how the Romans saw conquered peoples, not treating them with any particular warmth, but very inclined to keep things running smoothly. A common strategy was to designate client kingdoms to preserve the local order, within the broader aegis of Rome's authority. This could be done on its own, or made as a first step before direct Roman administration, or instead done to pacify a frontier with the light touch of diplomacy rather than throwing legions at it. Most cultural transmission between the Romans and their new subjects involved the barbaric party taking on Roman customs to become more civilized. But the diversity of cultures within the empire produced a wide variety in what it meant to be Roman, as Rome was in turn influenced by local language, art, dress, and, most crucially, religion. Having more or less copy-pasted their entire pantheon, Rome had no trouble seeing opportunities for crossover between cultures and doing DBZ fusions on similar deities. This is not how Rome treated Judaism. For one, Judaism was pointedly non-polytheistic, but it also didn't help that Rome and the province of Judea had a frequently adversarial relationship. After a bloody conquest by Pompey, a string of oppressive governors tightened the screws on Judea until a revolt broke out in 66 AD, whereupon Vespasian delegated the war to his son, and soon-to-be, emperor, Titus. Jerusalem was ultimately sacked and looted, as the commemorative Arch of Titus shows legionaries carting off a giant menorah, and the Jews went into diaspora after the destruction of the Second Temple. There are faint echoes of this in how Rome treated Christianity, another monotheistic religion considered subversive to the empire. But for these first 2 centuries, persecution of Christians was only a sporadic and localized concern. Now, whether it was karma for Jerusalem or just bad luck, Titus got hit by twin crises during his brief 2 years as emperor. In addition to another fire in Rome, he had to pick up the soot-covered pieces after Mount Vesuvius went kaplooey on the entire Bay of Naples. After he died, his brother became emperor, continuing some trends and resuming others from earlier, like more big building projects after the fire, more power stripped away from the Senate, and more getting assassinated. This time, the Praetorian Guard further bullied the new Emperor Nerva to adopt the General Trajan as his heir. And for all the inherent corruption that led us to this point, this is where things start, really getting shiny. Trajan was a military master who pushed Roman territory to its fullest extent and built a triumphal column to commemorate how dope his conquest of Dacia was. The spoils of this newly subjugated province paid for yet more public works, including the last and grandest forum in Rome, complete with 2 libraries. And this is a pleasant running theme this century. Anyone can spend money on their own palaces, but only a real G gives it back to his people. Trajan's conquest of Mesopotamia was impressively flashy but completely untenable, and his successor Hadrian had no interest in more outward expansion, instead focusing on fortifying Britannia and Germania and otherwise splashing money on monuments across the empire. Rome hadn't completely given up hope of walloping its enemies, as even the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius spent 14 long years begrudgingly waging war against the increasingly pesky Germans. But I think this is about when the practical reality finally set in. All the rich or easy borderland territories had already been taken, so the strategy of subjugate everything that looks at you funny was no longer viable, and this is where Rome topped out. That's far from terrible, as these last three of the so-called good emperors presided over a Rome at the absolute height of its power and prosperity, and there's plenty to respect in several decades of pleasantly quiet history characterized by wise rulers and a steady empire. But, and remember now, we're talking about Rome here. It won't be long until the Romans' legendary discipline starts to lapse and things go ouch. Because the great SPQR always maintained the potential for a remarkably precipitous drop. But for now, there wasn't a better time to inhabit beautiful cities, to enjoy brilliant engineering, to prosper from expansive trade, and to live in a secure society. It wasn't always the best, but it was Roman civilization at its best, and honestly, doing our best is all we should ask. When discussing the history of Rome, it is only natural to come across a handful of points at which things seem to go very wrong. War here, plague there, civil war over here, the crisis of the 3rd century. Another general marches his army on Rome, and after a certain point it doesn't even register. But these are all fairly momentary crises. A bad time, to be sure, but ultimately a self-contained catastrophe. Yet there is one truly abysmal chapter in Roman history that takes the cake. A quintuple-barrel calamity for the ages. And no, I'm not talking about the Byzantines because I'm not looking to cry today. I'm talking about the crisis of the 3rd century, which, by every reasonable prediction, should have wiped out everything. Fully everything. Yet, in a classic twist of Roman irony, the causes of this crisis and even a few of its symptoms would become the strategies used by Roman emperors to end the crisis and even keep Rome going for centuries to come. So let's take a look to find out how on earth that is possible. The Roman Empire entered the 200s AD in an iffy state. The golden age of the last century was losing some of its shine thanks to a succession of truly garbage emperors, starting with Commodus the gladiator tyrant, and not getting much better. But beyond the scandalous hedonism of emperors with more concubines than sense lay far more dangerous habits, like how Emperor Alexander Severus bought the loyalty of larger and larger armies by ballooning their pay. To afford this, he debased the currency by mixing the gold and silver with plebeiodoric metals, which tanked their value. And far from actually protecting Rome, this dynamic just gave the army leverage. In the old Augustan days, legions served at the pleasure of the emperor, but now the emperor was just some guy who wore purple, and if Commodus could get strangled to death in a bath by his wrestling buddy, the bar for intimidating, puppeting, or just replacing an emperor was like 5 Praetorian guards. But then, whom's to replace him with? Why, one of the generals, of course. And this was the same basic trick that Sulla and Caesar had pulled, but it saved the legwork of marching an army on Rome. Efficiency. So in the 50 years since, the first guy got axed. Over 20 such barracks emperors took their brief turn at the top. These guys weren't at the most legitimate since they conspicuously weren't at the children or legal heirs of the previous emperor, but hey-yah, you're the emperor. Never mind that another general 2 provinces over is taking notes on how you got to that point. You'll be fine. For a few months. All it took was some general beating up some Goths for their soldiers to say, "Great job, you should be the emperor." And then they get ideas and suddenly there's a mini civil war to sort out. And all this squabbling left the door wide open for Rome's rivals beyond the frontier to come right on in. Which frontier, you may ask? Good question. All of them. In the good old days, Germania was the primary ouch zone, but now the entire north was subject to incursions, from the Rhine all the way across the Danube, with fun new friends like Franks, Marcomanni, Goths, and plenty others. Some of these migrations were simply people looking for new lands to settle, while others were significantly more forceful. Terrifyingly, they also sailed down the Atlantic coast and into the eastern seas, striking as far as Athens in 267. The Roman army was good, but it wasn't that good. When an emperor focused on one area, another was left wide open. But when the emperor tried to delegate, he might find his trusty general scheming for that big promotion. Meanwhile, the eastern frontier was also a nightmare. The Parthians has been a sore spot for Rome since Moneybags Crassus was defeated and supposedly taxidermied with gold back in 53 BC. But Parthia rarely went on the offensive, they were just hard to subjugate, so all of Rome's failed campaigns were essentially self-inflicted. However, the newly formed Sassanid Persian Empire, which took their place in the 220s, was far better organized and much more of an outward threat. In the 250s, King Shapur pushed into Armenia, Roman Mesopotamia, and briefly into the Levant. The Sassanid menace would become a running theme for the next few centuries, but it came out of the gate real fast in the mid-200s. In 260, they captured Emperor Valerian in battle, whereafter the king used him as a footstool, as if being the emperor wasn't bad enough already. But let's not limit our sample size. It was miserable to be any kind of Roman nowadays. We've got coins getting debased throughout the century to bribe the army, trade routes constantly disrupted by war, and entire regions being wiped out by invasions and counterattacks. Plus, a plague in the 250s killed thousands a day in Rome and whittled cities like Alexandria down to half, which in turn drastically reduced the labor force available to farm and fight, resulting in widespread food and soldier shortages. As if the actual wars weren't enough of a problem, piracy within the empire was rampant, so cities and provinces spent what little resources they had on defensive walls and small forts along major roads. All of this made clear that the society enjoyed during the Pax Romana was long gone, as it required the stability of strong government and a strong military, both of which were fully absent here in the 200s. Functions of government were carried out primarily by the army, who were only accountable to their very stabably general. Luckily, when Rome worked, it worked. So if those political and military foundations could be patched up, at least on a local level, things could be all right. Now, believe it or not, the first 3 decades of the crisis were actually rather straightforward and even a bit tame compared to what went down after 260. Valerian, being captured by Persia, left Rome to his son and co-emperor Gallienus. Faced with the problem of everything everywhere all of the time, he was happy to delegate the Rhineland frontier to Postumus, a general and governor of Roman Germania. Naturally, it took all of 5 minutes for Postumus to be acclaimed as emperor, but not for all of Rome, just the western provinces. Gallienus couldn't really do anything about this, so Postumus had free rein to form a quasi-intendant state in the west that stretched from Britannia through Gaul and Germania and down into Hispania. He created parallel Roman institutions like the Senate and consuls and had no intention of causing trouble with the rest of Rome. He just wanted his slice, and he was able to defend it fairly well. Meanwhile, a strikingly similar story plays out on the other end of the empire, where Prince Odenathus of Palmyra fought back against King Shapur and began acting independently of the new Emperor Gallienus. Rome entrusted Odenathus with defense of the east and granted him governorship of the provinces of Cilicia and Syria down to Arabia. With only the eastern front to worry about, Odenathus held off the Sassanids until his assassination in 267, when his widow Zenobia became the de facto ruler of Palmyra and governor of all those provinces. Like in the west, this Palmyrene territory was essentially an independent state allied to Rome rather than provinces within it. And Rome was too occupied to really complain until 270, when Zenobia took advantage of a couple quick emperor deaths to annex Egypt and Galatia and proclaim her son as Imperator Caesar Augustus, which we can now fairly categorize as open revolt. Even then, the new emperor only cared that Egyptian grain exports stayed on schedule, and it as painfully telling that he could see part of his empire in a state of active rebellion and think, "Hey, I'll double back to that one later, I have more immediate problems." Plus, half of Egypt was in favor of their annexation. It seems weird, but you can see why. The Palmyrene Empire and the Gallic Empire were smaller, more nimble, more stable, and slightly less susceptible to upstart barracks emperors. It just felt good to know that the person in charge was only one province over, rather than halfway across the sea and probably in the process of getting murdered by his own guards. Really, the actions of Postumus and Zenobia show that they did work in the interest of Rome, just their corner of Rome, independently, and with the power of an emperor. Both states paid consistent homage to Rome, and despite how bad it looks on a map, were far less of a problem for the emperor than his own usurping generals, and even arguably a help, as they each removed an entire front from the emperor's to-do list. And this, wildly, set the stage for their later reconquest, as the Emperor Aurelian was free to focus the first few years of his reign squarely on fighting rival usurpers and barbarians along the Danube and, in Italy. In 271, he drove the Alemanni tribe off the peninsula and built a new system of walls around Rome. He also organized a retreat from the always slightly untenable province of Dacia, making the much more defensible Danube River the consistent imperial border. With the northern front temporarily settled, he turned east, defeating Zenobia and reconquering the Palmyrene territories by the end of 273, and then the next year he schlepped west to reincorporate the Gallic state. To the empire's collective astonishment, Aurelian had reunified Rome under the singular authority of the emperor in just a few years, and was granted the title of Restitutor Orbis, no small praise. With the world restored, he turned his focus to reform of the state. But we're not out of the woods yet because Aurelian got murdered by his own troops. In the decade following, things were definitely better but still kinda crap, with uncomfortably squishy emperors, a non-functioning economy, and more Frankish invasions in the 270s. But more people presented a new opportunity, and Rome essentially employed them in the reconstruction of devastated cities and farmland in exchange for letting them stay. This practice becomes quite a big deal in later centuries. So in the 250s and 60s, the empire spiraled out of control, and the 270s saw big progress, but the 280s and 90s are where Roman authority finally came back, during the reign and reforms of Diocletian. After his acclamation as emperor in 284, he issued more stable currency, firmly separated military and civil leadership to stop the army muscling in on the state, and moved the western seat of government up to Mediolanum to better oversee the front, while he took up residence in the eastern city of Nicomedia. Further, he delegated regional authority to his most capable officers and made his general Maximian co-emperor in 286. Two emperors wasn't a new idea, but by placing Maximian in charge of the west and Diocletian taking the east, this arrangement looked awful similar to the business with Gaul and Palmyra, except this time it was intentional and formalized by intermarrying the families, which also created a line of legitimate succession. In 293, he expanded this setup by adding two junior co-emperors known as Caesars to support the two senior Augusti. This tetrarchy kept Diocletian firmly at the top, but each emperor had regional autonomy. By recognizing that Rome tended to split along geographic fault lines, Diocletian's diet federalism turned a perennial problem into a stabilizing strength. He also snuffed the threat of civil wars by cutting all the provinces in half, so each of the 100 governors had a clearer responsibility and less power to stand up against his local tetrarch. He also grouped these new small provinces into 12 regional dioceses to really layer the strata onto government.